On the prequel to the 32nd episode, we're learning about evil versus evil and previewing Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Hello and welcome back to the prequel to the 32nd episode of This Film Is Lit, the podcast where we talk about movies that are based on books. We're going back into Harry Potter after our brief foyer into Where the Wild Things Are, a brief diversion as we tackle the monstrosity that is Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. That will be next week's episode. We have it's going to be a brief prequel episode, but we have a few segments here. So we're going to get right into our first segment, learning what this film is lit. Evil versus evil.
No matter what anybody tells you, words and ideas can change the world.
So that's evil versus evil in all caps.
Yes. There's probably a better way to describe this, or a better name for this segment. But I was inspired to kind of talk about this by the line I literally just read the other day by Sirius Black himself. And the characters are talking to him about Umbridge. And Ron, I believe it is, says she's terrible enough to be a Death Eater. Mm-hmm. And Sirius responds by saying, yeah, but the world isn't split into good people and Death Eaters.
Too true.
It's too true, and I thought it would be an interesting topic to discuss as we kind of continue on with the themes that are introduced throughout the books as they progress. I think this is the first book where this sort of idea comes up a lot more. Mm-hmm. It's definitely throughout to some extent.
Yeah, it's touched on throughout the series.
It's explicitly stated in the line I read by Sirius in this one. But yeah, it's definitely touched upon throughout, but this is where it kind of really starts to pick up post book 4 with the actors within the ministry and other people along those lines versus compared to the Death Eaters and Voldemort himself. So we're going to set up a few of the characters that are pivotal in this book or important in this book, mainly or mostly speaking, that aren't what you would qualify as evil, capital EVIL, in the sense that they are not supporters of Lord Voldemort. They are not Lord Voldemort. One of these is kind of on the fence as opposed as in terms of supporters of Lord Voldemort. But there's a discussion of it in the book that makes it seem like they're not at least explicitly like they weren't Death Eaters.
Yeah,
at least. So they're not capital EVIL, but they are evil in another sense, or they are bad in another sense, and we'll discuss kind of the importance of the theme and why it's included and why we like it as an addition and what we think it brings to the series. So here's some of the characters that are lowercase EVIL in this book that previously weren't. Well, at the end of 4, Fudge was, but the first one is Fudge, and some of the things that kind of that he represents that are lowercase evils, that he's incompetent, he's ignorant, he's more worried about maintaining his power and the status quo within society than he is dealing with actual issues that are occurring. He's very much an ostrich sticking his head in the sand because he wants to maintain his, I know that's a myth, but he wants to maintain his comfort level. Yeah. He is the prime minister. He wants to keep being the prime minister, and he knows if he has to deal, and he wants to keep being the prime minister and not have to deal with the very real and difficult problem of a rising fascist wizard regime. Yeah,
Fudge is scared.
Yeah, and he's scared, yeah.
He responds to that fear by lashing out and by, like you said, by sticking his head in the sand instead of by rising to the occasion and doing something about it. And up to this point, he's been more or less, kind of ineffective, but an okay guy.
Yeah, just fine. Other than as we mentioned, the end of book 4 is where this really comes to light. Yes. But then this book 5 is the sort of continuation and escalation of that within Fudge. Right. And then the other thing he is jealous. Because he's immensely jealous of Dumbledore and Dumbledore's ability. And there's backstory in this book about how everybody wanted Dumbledore to be the prime minister after Voldemort's downfall, but that Dumbledore didn't want to do it. So Fudge basically got it. But now Fudge is constantly looking over his shoulder, worried that everybody's going to kick him out and put Dumbledore in power. So he's incredibly jealous. And obviously a lot of evil characters also have like evil characters have a lot of these characteristics. But these are some people that aren't categorically evil. Right. But
yeah, I mean, and what we're talking about here is kind of the line between characters who are storybook evil, and characters who are maybe people you encounter in real life,
right? And more so on top of that a lot of these people are, at least in principle, opposed quote unquote to the actual evil. Like Fudge, absolutely. If he were to overcome all of his numerous character flaws, he's not a supporter of Voldemort. Right. He would stand against him. He's just, because of all of his other flaws and problems, won't admit it, doesn't see that Voldemort's back, won't believe it, that sort of thing. So they are, in theory, opponents of the fascism that is rising, but in practice are enablers of it. Yes. And so that's sort of one of the other reasons I want to talk about, I think it's very topical politically. But I just, wanted to kind of contrast that. So yes, they are more realistic in the sense that they're not just like, I mean, we know Voldemort's motivations are, wants to conquer death, and he covets power and to rise above his namesake, and doesn't like Muggles for numerous reasons because of his family issues and all these other things and his heritage and that sort of thing. But he is, to some extent, kind of not cartoon. He's nuanced and layered, but he is a storybook villain. Yes. Who is out for evil things to do evil things. These people aren't motivated for evil purposes necessarily, but they have the side effect of doing, not side effect, but through all their flaws and that sort of thing, their very human flaws, do end up being enabling evil. So Fudge was the first one. Umbridge, obviously. And now she borders... In some ways,
she borders on evil.
True, but she's also not a Death Eater. I mean, she's not and again, there's different types of evil, obviously, and she absolutely is, and that's why I'm still classifying all of these people to some extent. They're on some sort of the spectrum of evil, but I think there's a crossover point, at least in the narrative of the book, between Death Eaters and Voldemort and the rest of society.
No, absolutely.
There's a hardline crossover, but it's that the book also wants you to pay attention to the fact that even if you don't cross that hard line, doesn't mean you're not still part of that to some extent. So Umbridge, in contrast to Fudge, is very competent, at least seemingly, mostly competent. But she's also incredibly ignorant and worried about maintaining power and status quo. She's also a bigot, which Fudge we don't seem to think necessary, at least not outwardly, outspokenly so, in the way that Umbridge is.
I feel like Fudge is a bigot in the same way that maybe like a lot of wizards are. It's part of the fabric of their society, so he is, but it's not something that necessarily like is made a point of. Right. Because it's just kind of part of the fabric of that world. Right. Umbridge, on the other hand, we learn has like specifically drafted legislation that is very discriminatory and awful. Yes. Yeah, she's much more in the line of somebody who, comparing it to something like marriage equality, who's drafting legislation opposing this, whereas opposed to like your general churchgoer who supports the system that, or not every, but like your general sort of vaguely conservative churchgoer who supports the system that also is pushing a narrative, or, is pushing anti-marriage equality. It's not the same equivalent, but it's, she's also a giant bigot. Percy falls lower on this list, but he's also in there because he's incredibly loyal, but to a fault. Yeah, and to the wrong people. Yeah, he's loyal to the wrong people.
And the reason he's loyal to the wrong people is that he's power hungry in a weird way. He's not power hungry in the same way that like Umbridge or Voldemort is, but he's power hungry / approval hungry in the way that that Percy is. Like he wants to prove how competent he is all the time, and so that by doing that, and the way he thinks to do that is through government. And rising up through government and, and kind of making a name for himself. And that stems from his insecurities with his family and the fact that they've always been poor and sort of looked down upon by the wizarding community. He wants to kind of rise above that station. So he goes about doing that by being incredibly loyal to the higher ups within the ministry. Just turns out that at the time where he's going through this, the people that are higher up in the ministry are all terrible.
Right.
So like, if, I have a feeling if Percy were to have been in the ministry 10 years ago, or whenever, when there was, if Dumbledore was the Minister of Magic, he absolutely would probably be on their side from day one. You know what I mean? Like, he would be on the side of Voldemort's back, because he would be listening to whoever was above him power-wise that he could rise up underneath. You know what I mean?
Right. So Percy's character flaw here is that he's kind of incapable of thinking for himself.
Yes.
He's a rule follower to the nth degree.
Yeah, he's strictly rule abiding, and in the face of outside important events that are going on, he's kind of blind to all of those things. Yeah, and just sort of worried about what the rules.
I think too, like the idea of him being embarrassed by his family is important here because the Weasleys, we know, are kind of considered like blood traitors. Even to some extent by people who don't outwardly buy into the blood status idea, but because it's part of the fabric of their society, they do kind of buy into it. And Percy kind of buys into it. Yeah. And he maybe thinks of his family as people he doesn't want to be associated with because he wants to make a name for himself. Right.
Yeah. Then this is another different one because I think these also absolutely qualify as evil. The Black family, and now we only really run into Sirius in this one, but I'm saying as a whole, we get some of their history and that sort of thing. And Sirius has a line where he specifically says that other than he has cousins and whatnot that did join the Death Eaters and were Death Eaters, obviously Bellatrix being one of them, but like his parents weren't Death Eaters. But and they maybe they did sort of the Lucius Malfoy public facing type of like. They weren't overt supporters of or like public necessarily supporters of Voldemort, but very much were supporters of Voldemort. Yeah. But they're also giant bigots. They hate Muggles and very obsessed with pure bloodedness and wizard blood and that sort of thing. They're power hungry, wealth obsessed, and miserly. They collect this huge. Their house, as we see throughout the course of the beginning of the book, is full of all kinds of trinkets.
It's huge and it's just full of junk.
Treasures and junk, but a lot of it that's worth a lot of money and, all this kind of crazy, like, dark artifacts and just all this stuff. And they were also traditionalists, and that kind of ties back into the sort of pure blood, wizard blood obsession that they had. And so they're sort of like,
if we drew an analogy to like Nazi Germany, let's say, the Black family isn't necessarily like signing up to be in the army. No. Maybe some of them are.
Some of them are, but they're proud of those people.
Yes,
but
and they're definitely supportive of all the policies.
Yes, they're the rich, they're the upper class. They're not the ones out fighting or they're not in the Nazi regime. They're not making it all happen, but they're benefiting from it. They're supportive of it. Yeah, and sort of they're along for the ride. And then finally, and this is the wizarding community at large as a force of evil kind of in general, because the wizard community at large is ignorant. It tends to be, when you get a lot of people tend to be pretty ignorant, status quo driven. A lot of them are bigots, and they're also partially misinformed by another one that I could have put on here, but I didn't just for the sake of time, was the newspaper. The Daily Prophet, and whoever the editor. We never actually know the editor of the Daily Prophet.
No, we don't.
Which is kind of interesting. That seems like that could have been an interesting character to like meet the editor of the Daily Prophet. But,
but the Daily Prophet as an entity is above all self-serving. Yes, it exists to sell itself, as Rita Skeeter says. Yes, at some point in this book,
which tends to be the case for a lot of the media. Tends to have to do that. You have to. Sell what you make. Well, that's a whole other topic for a whole other day, so I'm not even going to get into it. But the wizarding community at large, as sort of not any individual being evil, but as an amorphous mass of humanity, of wizardry they enable, in their complacency and their ignorance and their being misinformed, they enable this festering, rising fascism, for lack of a better word, in the shape of Voldemort and his supporters. And so, again, they're not evil, quote. They're not Voldemort supporters. In fact, many of them are not, actively not Voldemort.
But like you said, through their complacency, they enable that evil to perpetuate.
Yes.
So what I think part of what makes these characters, some of them are additions in this book. They're new characters. Umbridge, some of them are changes in characters Percy that we already knew. But I think what makes it really great is that they represent versions of evil that readers are more likely to recognize and identify with. Like, Voldemort is essentially Wizard Hitler. Yeah. So, of course, he's super evil, but most of us don't really have, like, a real life frame of reference for that. We haven't encountered that anywhere outside of, like, history books. Yeah. And I mean, history is real and history happened, but if you're reading about it, you might as well be reading a piece of fiction. Right. But a lot of us do have a real life frame of reference for people who abuse their power, or for people who are ignorant or bigoted, or for people who are driven by selfish, self-centered motivations. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what that kind of plays into as well is that adding these sort of lesser evil characters who we haven't really had a bunch of, other than kind of like Snape to some extent in the previous books. Snape is, every book they think he's going to be evil and the villain, but he ends up not. I mean, he is evil, but he ends up not being the villain of the book. But he's really kind of been the only thing. And then obviously, Malfoy, like the other students and that sort of thing. But they're not all these other big characters who are evil. And I think it starts to show by bringing these in, the young readers, that sort of this nuance. Because a lot of times in children's media, books, TV, movies, whatever, bad characters tend to just be bad because it's easier for children to understand. It's sort of simple. It's also just, it makes storytelling a little bit easier, and you can make it shorter. If you're trying to tell this complicated, nuanced backstory of this villain in a 10-page children's book, it's a little tougher. You know what I mean? Like, it's tough to kind of give that layer of nuance and motivation to why is this person evil. So they tend to just be like the quote unquote bad guy, or girl or whatever. And we have that in Harry Potter to some extent. We have that with Voldemort and the Death Eaters. And now they do, JK does flesh out sort of why Voldemort is the way he is. He's not just a bad guy. He is. He's not just a bad guy. But we also have characters in the ones that we've discussed who enable the obviously evil, who aren't themselves obviously evil. Percy is not obviously an evil character. Fudge is not obviously an evil character. Umbridge is more so to some extent. She's definitely played as the villain of this book for most of it. And the wizarding community at large, even more so, is obviously not evil. But they do enable those that are obviously evil. Because sometimes, like I said, sometimes the enablers, they're evil, and they are themselves evil. Umbridge, the Black family, etc. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're just naive, or they're ignorant, or they're misinformed, like Percy and like Fudge and like the wizarding community at large. It's really complicated and it's nuanced, and it's important that kids think about these kind of things, because the cycle of evil flourishing within the crevices of the comfort of those in power will always be timely, I think. It's almost always how fascism and authoritarianism take root. It's how injustice is overlooked. Evil rising and spreading takes a few evil operators to set things in motion and a bunch of comfortable people to ignore that it's happening. So I really think that it's an interesting and important element to add to the books and keep incorporating throughout the remainder of the books. Because, I think it's very accurate to how the world works. And I think it's a good thing to kind of...
No, it definitely is. We talked in the Goblet of Fire episode and in the Prisoner of Azkaban episode about various ways that that Rowling and that the creators of the films kind of grow up the series, and this is one of those ways, like kind of moving away from more childish ideas about what evil is and what bad people are into a kind of a more nuanced look at it. And it is like that quote, you kind of paraphrased it, that the world is an evil place, not because of evil people, but because of good people who look on and do nothing.
Yeah. That was vaguely
Similar idea.
Same idea that I was going for. I just kind of rephrased it. But yeah. So yeah, that's evil versus evil. Or how the world isn't split into good people and Death Eaters. Book facts.
You have been told that a certain dark wizard is at large. This is a lie.
It's not a lie. I saw it.
We've got to be able to defend ourselves. And if Umbridge refuses to teach us how, we need someone who will.
Every great wizard in history has started out as nothing more than what we are now. If they can do it, why not us?
Order of the Phoenix. Book facts. Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix released on the 21st of June, year 2003. And that is a wait of 3 years since The Goblet of Fire came out. And the longest wait in between Harry Potter books. The waits between 5 and 6 and 6 and 7 were both 2 years. So that is our longest dry spell between Harry Potter books.
Yeah.
And at 870 pages in the US edition, at least, it is also the longest Harry Potter book.
Yes, it is. It's much shorter. I noticed it's like 750 pages in the British version. They must like format differently or something.
Yeah,
Font,
probably.
or I don't know. Because I saw that, I was like, how is it 100 pages shorter? There's no way they changed it. It's not like it's
no,
just,
right. It's still in English, but yeah, they must. So the series at this point was already a global phenomenon. And the book set new pre-order records with thousands of people lining up outside of bookstores the night before it released to secure their copy at midnight. Mm-hmm. Did you ever get to go to a midnight release?
7, for sure.
For 7?
I don't remember. I would have probably done 6 too, and maybe 5, but I vividly remember 7. I remember going with friends from high school. I never did get to go to one.
I wish I would have been able to.
Yeah.
Anyway, 5 million copies of Order of the Phoenix were also sold within the first 24 hours of publication.
Wow.
So not too shabby.
No.
But despite increased security around the book's publication and release, almost 8,000 copies were stolen from a Merseyside warehouse on the 15th of June that year in 2003. I tried to figure out, whatever happened with that. Yeah. I couldn't find any follow-up for it. If anybody knows, I would love to hear if they ever found all of these 8,000 copies or whatever. I couldn't find any follow-up on it, but I thought it was kind of funny. It's a lot of copies of a book to just run away with.
Yeah.
Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix was met with mostly positive reviews from both readers and critics. New York Times writer John Leonard praised the novel, saying, "The Order of the Phoenix starts slow, gathers speed, and then skateboards with somersaults to a furious conclusion. As Harry gets older, Rowling gets better." However, he also criticized the one-note Draco Malfoy and the predictable Lord Voldemort. Not unfair criticisms, I think.
Malfoy definitely becomes less one note in the final 2 books.
Yeah, he gets fleshed out a little bit in the last 2 books.
Yeah.
The book was cited as an American Library Association Best Book for Young Adults and as an American Library Association Notable Book. It also received the Oppenheim Toy Portfolio 2004 Gold Medal, along with several other awards.
Let's move along to Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix film facts.
The Ministry's going to have a full uprising on their hands. It's your turn now.
Discipline your mind.
We're in this together.
If Voldemort's building up an army, then I want to fight.
Look at me!
Don't have a ton of facts here. I could probably get more, have had a few more, but I kind of culled it down to some of the stuff I thought was most interesting so that this didn't go on for too long. First one, Ivana Lynch, who plays Luna in the film, earned the role after auditioning among 15,000 other girls. There was an open audition, and 15,000 people auditioned for the role, but she ultimately landed it. But another person who was considered for the role was Saoirse Ronan. And I actually thought she would be pretty good because she
would have been interesting.
I don't wish she had done it because I think Ivana Lynch was perfect as Luna. It's one of the best castings, and I mean, in a series of perfect castings, she's among the best in my opinion. But yeah, Saoirse Ronan, which you may know her from a handful of things, including The Host, which she's not particularly good in, but she's really, really good in Lady Bird. And she does a good job playing sort of, at least in Lady Bird, sort of unique, quirky characters. So I think she would have been pretty good. So Helen McCrory, who I didn't know who that was at first, was first cast as Bellatrix Lestrange, but she had to pull out because she was pregnant and they were doing all the action sequences at the end of the film. And she wasn't going to be able to do it. Ultimately, Helena Bonham Carter got cast in the role. But you may know Helen McCrory, because like I said, I didn't recognize the name, from Harry Potter, where she went on to play Bellatrix. Where she went on to play Bellatrix's sister, Narcissa, in Half-Blood Prince. And
so she's Draco's mom.
Yeah, she's Narcissa Malfoy.
Interesting.
So she originally was going to be Bellatrix Lestrange. They didn't, she like I said, she couldn't do it. So they're like, oh, you can just play her sister in the later movies. The Black's family's house elf creature was cut from the film in one of the early drafts of the script. However, Rowling talked to the filmmakers and was like, you should include him. And she said, I wouldn't cut him if I were you. Or you can, but if you get to make a 7th film, you'd be tied in knots.
Oh boy.
So he was added back into the script. Because Creature, obviously, if you read the books, has an important role to play.
Yeah, he has kind of a pivotal role for a particular important plot point later on.
Which I realized I had forgotten, and I still have forgotten what that is. I do remember that there is something important he does, but I don't recall what it is. So that'll be a fun twist. That's funny that you remember that, because I could not recall what it was. But yeah, so they added him back in. British television director David Yates was chosen to direct this film. After Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the director Mike Newell decided to drop out, didn't want to do it. But they did offer him the role, but he just bowed out. David Yates will go on to direct the rest of the series, as well as both of the Fantastic Beasts films that have come out. So he's done every Harry Potter film since Order of the Phoenix. They also offered the job to Jean-Pierre Jeunet. They came back to Del Toro and said, are you sure? Or do you want to do it now? Because he was offered 3, and he didn't end up doing 3. So they came back and said, maybe 5? And he was like, no. And Matthew Vaughn, and then Mira Nair, who I'm not sure who that is. I've never heard of her.
Okay, obviously I know Del Toro, and I know Vaughn, because Vaughn directed Stardust, which is one of my favorite movies, but I don't know Jean-Pierre Jeunet, I believe. Or Jeunet, maybe. And I would have given a lot to see either Matthew Vaughn or Jean-Pierre Jeunet. I think David Yates has done a fine job with the films, but we really would have been interested to see either of those. Yes, like you mentioned, Matthew Vaughn, director of Stardust, but also the Kick-Ass films, and most recently, and maybe best, the Kingsman films. Oh, that's right. He did do those.
Yes. Which we thought was funny. I remember having a discussion after we saw the first Kingsman film, and then I was like, I looked up who the director was, and I was like, oh, you won't guess. That's the guy who did Stardust. I knew he did Kick-Ass as well. But yeah, so I think that would have been really interesting. But Jean-Pierre Jeunet, most famously, is the director of Amélie.
Oh.
The writer and director
that would
of
have
Amélie.
been interesting.
Would have been really interesting. I wrote it down. I go, man, I would have loved to see that. I thought about it. I'm not exactly sure that it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it maybe doesn't make perfect sense, but it would have been interesting.
It would have been interesting. It really would have been interesting. I think it might have been more interesting to see his take on 3 than 5. But I think it could have worked. Because I think 3 was where it teetered right on the edge of that sort of, because he also has some weirder stuff. Like his movie Delicatessen is very strange. He also directed a very bad Alien film. I can't remember which one it is. Resurrection? I don't know. One of the late sequels he directed, and it did not come out well. But Amelie is my favorite film of all time, and I really would have been interested to see what he did with a Harry Potter film, but they all turned it down. So we got David Yates. Steve Kloves, the screenwriter for the first 4 films, had other commitments, and so this is the only film he has not written. Of all the Harry Potter films, including Fantastic Beasts, he did not write this one. The rest of them he penned. And originally, they shot a 3-hour film of Order of the Phoenix, which makes sense when you have 870 pages. However, they had to cut it down in the final edit because they had to cut like 45 minutes out. They're like, we can't have a 3-hour film that a bunch of 12-year-olds are going to go see. So they decided to chop it down, which that's disappointing. I do wonder if there must be a lot of deleted scenes.
Surely.
I don't know if there's 45 minutes of deleted scenes on the DVD extras, but because that seems normally when you get the deleted scenes on DVDs, there's like 10 or 15 minutes total. I would be amazed if there was 45 minutes that they included everything they cut, but maybe there is out there somewhere, like the director's cut.
And just as a reminder, we do watch the theatrical cuts.
We don't watch the ones with the extra scenes. We watch all the theatrical cuts just because...
reasoning that those are the ones most people will be most familiar with.
Although I think I don't know. I'd have to check. I think a lot of the TV showings do the extended versions because I know a lot of times like Lord of the Rings they show the extended ones on TV.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if they do the same with Harry Potter. So if you're ever rewatching them on TV, you might be getting extended cuts. I'm not never sure which ones they show on TV more often. You would think they'd show the shorter ones, but they show the longer ones and cram in more commercial breaks, honestly, so I wouldn't be surprised.
Honestly, theatrical cuts versus director's cuts make this really hard.
Yeah, it does make it
this
tough.
So much harder than it should be. Especially
for certain scenes, because there's things that we say, oh, I wish they would have included this that are in the deleted scenes. Yeah. But we don't go out and look and do all that research to see how, go find all of the deleted scenes and watch and make sure, that thing we talked about was actually in that deleted scene, so... If you're ever like, hey, that is in the movie, it's probably in the director's cut or whatever. We're unaware. So that's going to do it for the prequel to the 32nd episode. And next week, it is Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Whew. It feels like it's been a long time since we did the Goblet of Fire episode.
I know.
A lot has happened. It has been like 3 weeks.
I still have to read like a third of this book.
I still have to read like half of this book. I'm like 400 pages in. And I felt like I was making good time for a while, but now I'm like, holy cow, what happened? I am falling behind. So it's but I have been really enjoying it, and there's lots of things I forgot. And again, I'm constantly reminded of how good J.K. Rowling is as I reread these, and how many little things she places throughout, and how, like we discussed in the Learning Things segment, just how relevant all of the themes and sort of how relevant all of the themes continue to be, even more so when you're an adult looking at the world. So that's it for the prequel. As I said before, until next time, keep reading books, keep watching movies, and keep being awesome.